I stood in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, as the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Luke had let himself in, like he always did, his presence a familiar rhythm in the quiet days that now defined my life. "Hey," he called, his deep voice carrying from the hallway. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, holding up a bottle of wine. "I thought we could share this tonight." I smiled, but my heart fluttered unexpectedly at the sight of him. He looked every bit the man his father had been, broad-shouldered and confident, but with a softness in his eyes that made him seem younger, more approachable. "Wine on a weeknight?" I teased, setting my mug down. "Consider it an early weekend," he replied with a grin that lit up the room, a grin that felt like it was just for me. That smile. I couldn't put my finger on why it affected me so much lately. But there was something about the way he looked at me that lingered in my thoughts longer than it should have. I chalked it up to my own loneliness. 3 years of widowhood and too many quiet nights had a way of making you notice things you shouldn't. He poured us each a glass and settled into the chair across from me. The kitchen felt warmer with him there, like his presence had a way of filling the empty spaces I'd grown used to. My life wasn't always this quiet. I used to be a woman of purpose. My days were filled with laughter, with plans and people, with a husband who, for better or worse, made me feel like I belonged to something larger than myself. But all of that ended when Bill died. It wasn't sudden. His illness gave us time to prepare, to say goodbye. But no amount of preparation could soften the hollow ache that followed. I'd stayed in this house out of habit, out of duty. But it felt too big now, too quiet. Luke had been the only constant. At 28, he had his own life. Work, friends, the occasional girlfriend. But he still made time to visit. He'd stop by after work to fix something that didn't really need fixing. Or bring groceries even when I insisted I didn't need them. I used to think he did it out of obligation, but lately, I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way he lingered, the way his gaze held mine just a moment longer than necessary, that made me wonder. That night, as we sat across from each other in the kitchen, the conversation drifted easily from topic to topic. He told me about a coworker who'd managed to back a truck into a loading dock, the story punctuated by his laughter. "It was like watching a slow-motion disaster," he said, shaking his head. "You could see it coming from a mile away, but no one could stop it." I laughed with him, the sound surprising me. It felt good to laugh again, to feel a lightness I hadn't known I'd been missing. But then his gaze shifted, and the humor faded from his expression. He leaned back in his chair, his glass cradled in his hand, and for a moment, he just looked at me. I knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of what that meant was almost suffocating. But beneath the fear and the doubt, there was something else. Hope? For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something new. Something terrifying, but full of possibility. And for now, that was enough. The morning light filtered through the living room windows, painting soft streaks of gold across the floor. I stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the coffee machine as it gurgled and hissed, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. But it didn't ground me the way it usually did. My thoughts were elsewhere, on the events of the night before, on Luke, on the way everything had changed. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, the ceramic grounding me just enough to keep my hands steady. The house felt quieter than usual, even though it was no quieter than it had been every other morning since Bill had passed. But something was different now. Something I couldn't ignore. When Luke left the night before, he'd kissed me softly, his hands lingering on my waist, his eyes searching mine as if asking for reassurance. "I meant it," he'd said again, his voice steady but tender. "I'm not going anywhere." Those words had stayed with me, replaying over and over in my mind. I sat down at the kitchen table, the steam from the coffee curling lazily in the air. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts a tangled web of doubt and longing. I wanted to believe him, to let myself lean into the warmth and comfort he offered. But what we'd done wasn't something that could be taken lightly. The world wasn't kind to people like us. People who crossed lines, who didn't fit neatly into the roles society had assigned to them. And while I told myself I didn't care what anyone thought, I couldn't shake the nagging voice in the back of my mind that warned of the consequences. The sound of his truck pulling into the driveway broke me out of my thoughts. I stood, my heart pounding as I moved to the window. He climbed out, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light, and for a moment, I hesitated. Should I let him in? Should I tell him we couldn't do this, that it was a mistake, that the world we were trying to create was impossible? But then I saw his face, open, calm, and so full of quiet determination, and I knew I couldn't shut him out. When I opened the door, he smiled, the same boyish grin that had always undone me. "Morning," he said, holding up a small bag. "I brought breakfast." I stepped aside, letting him in. "You didn't have to do that," I said softly. "I wanted to," he replied simply, setting the bag on the counter. "I figured you might not have eaten yet." We moved around the kitchen in silence, unpacking the bag and setting the table. It was such a small, ordinary thing, but it felt monumental in the wake of everything that had happened. When we finally sat down, the silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. He was the first to speak. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded. "You're thinking this won't work, that it's too complicated, too messy, that people won't understand." I looked away, his words hitting too close to the truth. "And you're probably right," he continued. "But I don't care. None of that matters to me." His honesty made my throat tighten. "It's not that simple, Luke," I said, my voice trembling. "There's so much to consider. What if we stopped worrying about the what ifs?" he interrupted, leaning forward. "What if we just took this one day at a time, you and me, no one else?" I swallowed hard, my hands twisting together in my lap. "I don't know if I'm brave enough for that." "You are," he said softly. "I've seen it. You're stronger than you think." His words filled the room, and for a moment, I let myself believe them. I looked up at him, and the sincerity in his eyes made my chest ache. After breakfast, we moved to the porch, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The world outside was alive with the sounds of birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so. Luke sat beside me, his arm draped casually over the back of the bench. We didn't speak for a long time, the silence between us filled with unspoken questions and answers. "I don't know where this is going," I said finally, my voice quiet. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I know where I want it to go." I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. "And where's that?" "With you," he said simply. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy but not oppressive. I didn't know what the future held or if this was something we could sustain. But in that moment, as I sat beside him with the sunlight warming my skin, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. When he left later that morning, I stood at the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the road. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel as empty as it usually did. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how we would navigate the challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't facing it alone, and maybe that was enough. "What?" I asked, my voice faltering under the weight of his stare. "Nothing," he said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You just seem different tonight. Happier." His words caught me off guard, and I looked away, busying myself with the bottle of wine. "I suppose it's been a while since I had company like this." "I like being here," he said, his tone earnest. "It feels comfortable." The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward but full, like there were things neither of us knew how to say. When he left that night, I stood in the doorway and watched him walk to his truck. The bottle of wine sat half empty on the counter, a reminder of the easy, unexpected warmth of the evening. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced back and gave me a small wave, his smile just visible in the glow of the porch light. My heart skipped, and I quickly shut the door, leaning against it as I exhaled a shaky breath. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Silly and foolish to feel. Whatever it was, I was feeling. But as I climbed into bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, his smile lingered in my mind, and I couldn't deny the small flicker of something unfamiliar taking root in my chest. The days after Luke's visit passed slowly, each one blending into the next in the way they always seemed to. Yet something had shifted. His smile, the way he'd said he liked being here. It lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't quite forget. I told myself it was nothing. Luke was kind, thoughtful, and attentive in a way I wasn't used to anymore. That didn't mean there was anything more to it. But as much as I tried to brush it off, I found myself looking forward to his next visit. It came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday morning, the sun bright, but the air cool enough to remind me that autumn wasn't far off. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters after breakfast, when I heard the familiar rumble of his truck in the driveway. He didn't knock, as usual, just let himself in and called out, "Morning." I glanced up as he stepped into the kitchen, carrying a toolbox. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, the fabric of his shirt clinging slightly to his chest from the warmth outside. "You're early," I said, forcing myself to sound casual. "Thought I'd get a jump on fixing that loose hinge on the back gate," he replied. "It's been bugging me every time I come over." I wanted to tell him it could wait, that he didn't need to keep finding reasons to help me, but the truth was, I didn't want to discourage him. He worked outside for most of the morning, while I busied myself in the garden, pulling weeds and pruning bushes. Occasionally, I'd glance over at him, watching as he bent over the gate or reached up to tighten a screw. His movements were fluid, confident, the kind that came naturally to someone who was used to working with their hands. At one point he caught me looking. "Everything okay?" he called, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Fine," I replied quickly, ducking my head and pretending to focus on the flowers. But my hands were shaking. Later he came inside for a glass of water. He leaned against the counter, his hair damp from sweat, and grinned at me. "That gate's as good as new," he said. "Thank you," I replied, handing him the glass. As he took it, his fingers brushed mine. Just a fleeting touch, but enough to send a spark of warmth up my arm. I froze for a moment, but he didn't seem to notice, draining the glass in one long sip. "You didn't have to do all this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, setting the glass down on the counter. "I like helping out. Besides, it gives me an excuse to hang around." His words were simple, said without hesitation, but they hit me harder than I expected. I busied myself with washing the glass, unsure how to respond. "Anyway," he continued, his tone lighter now, "I should probably head out. But I'll be back next week. I noticed the gutters are starting to sag a bit. I'll fix those for you." "You don't have to keep fixing things, Luke," I said, finally turning to face him. "I know," he replied, his gaze steady, "but I want to." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, walking him to the door. When he left, the house felt quieter than usual. Over the next few weeks, his visits became more frequent. He found reasons to come over: a leaky faucet, a broken light bulb, even an old birdhouse in the backyard that needed repairing. Each time, he stayed a little longer, our conversations stretching into the afternoons. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his work, his friends, and the things that frustrated him. I listened, offering advice when I could, but mostly just enjoying the sound of his voice. One afternoon, while he was fixing a loose floorboard in the hallway, I found myself sitting on the steps, watching him work. "Do you ever slow down?" I teased, resting my chin on my hand. He glanced up at me, his grin easy and boyish. "Not when I'm here. Too much to do." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. "Besides," he added, his tone softening, "it's nice having a reason to come over." The words hung in the air between us, their weight unmistakable. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He didn't press the moment, just went back to his work as if he hadn't said anything at all. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way he'd said it, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, it was like he was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. And the worst part, I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The days were growing shorter, and with each passing evening, the air seemed to cool just a little more. A gentle reminder that summer was slipping away. But Luke's visits didn't slow. If anything, he seemed to find more reasons to be here, and I found fewer reasons to question it. It wasn't just his presence that filled the house. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way his laugh echoed in the kitchen, or the way he stayed a little longer each time. Slowly, imperceptibly, the silence that had defined my life since Bill's passing was being replaced by something else. Something warmer. More alive. One evening after he'd fixed the gutters, he stayed for dinner. It wasn't planned, but neither of us seemed eager to end the day. I made pasta with what I had on hand, and we sat across from each other at the table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting a cozy warmth over the room. He told me about a project he was working on at his job, his enthusiasm evident as he spoke about the challenges he was facing. I listened, laughing at his jokes, feeling more at ease than I had in a long time. But there were moments when the conversation would lull, and the silence between us would feel charged, like there was something just beneath the surface neither of us dared to acknowledge. At one point, he reached for his glass of water, his hand brushing mine as he set it back down. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a spark up my arm, a reminder of the tension that had been building between us for weeks. "Sorry," he said softly, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "It's fine," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. The silence stretched, and I felt my pulse quicken. His gaze was steady, almost searching, and for a moment, I wondered if he was about to say something. But then he looked away, breaking the spell, and the moment passed. A week later, the weather took a turn. Heavy rain rolled in, drumming against the windows and turning the world outside into a gray haze. Luke showed up that evening, carrying a bag of groceries and an easy smile. "I thought I'd bring dinner this time," he said, setting the bag on the counter. I raised an eyebrow. "Dinner, huh? Let me guess, frozen pizza?" "Not this time." He grinned, pulling out a package of steaks and a bundle of fresh asparagus. "Figured I'd try impressing you for a change." "Impressing me?" I teased, but the way his smile softened made my heart skip a beat. We cooked together, the rain providing a soothing backdrop to the quiet rhythm we'd fallen into. He seasoned the steaks while I prepped the asparagus, our movements easy and unhurried, like we'd done this 100 times before. As we ate, the conversation flowed as easily as the wine he'd brought. He told me about a fishing trip he'd gone on years ago with Bill, his tone light but tinged with a hint of nostalgia. I shared a story about the time Bill had tried to build a birdhouse and ended up with more nails in his thumb than in the wood. We laughed. The kind of deep, genuine laughter that left me feeling lighter than I had in years. But as the evening wore on and the rain continued to fall, the space between us seemed to shrink. After dinner, we moved to the living room, settling onto the couch with our glasses of wine. The soft glow of the table lamp bathed the room in warm light, and for a while we just sat there, the sound of rain filling the silence. "I like this," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Like what?" I asked, turning to look at him. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Being here with you. It feels right." His words caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. I looked down at my glass, my fingers tracing the rim, and tried to steady the sudden fluttering in my chest. "Luke," I began, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know." I looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. The weight of his gaze was almost too much, but I couldn't look away. There was something in his expression, something vulnerable, raw, and so achingly familiar. That made my breath catch. The next time he came over, it was late afternoon. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the garden damp and glistening in the soft light of the setting sun. I was in the backyard, pulling weeds from the flower beds, when I heard his footsteps on the gravel path. "Hey," he called, his voice warm and easy. I looked up to find him standing there, his hands in his pockets, his smile softer than usual. "You're early," I said, brushing dirt from my gloves. "Figured I'd catch you before you finished out here," he replied, stepping closer. He crouched down beside me, his knee brushing against mine as he reached for a stray branch. The closeness was unexpected, and I felt my breath hitch, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us in the quiet of the garden. When I finally looked at him, his eyes were already on me, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Luke," I began, but the words caught in my throat. His hand brushed against mine, deliberate and gentle, and I felt a spark of warmth that spread through me like wildfire. "You don't have to say it," he said softly. "I know." The moment hung between us, heavy and electric, and I knew that something had changed. The line we'd been skirting for weeks was no longer just a boundary, It was a precipice. And we were standing on the edge. The sky was a bruised shade of gray when Luke arrived that evening. The soft rumble of thunder rolled in the distance as a light drizzle misted the windows. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the untouched crossword puzzle in front of me, when his truck pulled into the driveway. I heard the door creak open, his familiar voice calling out, "Hey, it's just me." His casualness had become a comfort, the way he made himself at home without hesitation. But tonight felt different. The storm outside seemed to seep into the house, bringing with it a tension that neither of us could quite ignore. He stepped into the kitchen, shaking the rain from his jacket and running a hand through his damp hair. "Sorry I didn't call first," he said, setting a small brown bag on the counter. "I brought dessert. Figured you might like some company tonight." His smile was soft, hesitant, as if testing the waters. I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Always happy for company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sat down, close enough that the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the earthy smell of rain. The quiet between us stretched, broken only by the occasional roll of thunder. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said after a moment, his tone careful. "You're not," I replied quickly. Too quickly. I cleared my throat, looking down at my hands. "I like having you here, Luke. It's nice, not being alone." He didn't respond right away, and when I finally looked up, his gaze was steady, searching. "You don't have to be alone," he said softly. My breath caught. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. We moved to the living room after dinner, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He had brought a bottle of wine, and as we sipped from our glasses, the conversation shifted from light-hearted banter to something deeper. He told me about his frustrations at work, the long hours and the thankless tasks, and how he often felt like he was going in circles. I listened, nodding, offering words of encouragement where I could. "You're too hard on yourself," I said, setting my glass on the coffee table. He leaned back against the couch, his arm draped casually along the backrest. "You're the only one who ever says that," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I smiled, shaking my head. "That's because it's true. You're capable of so much more than you give yourself credit for." He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made me feel exposed. "You always know what to say to make me feel better," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't think you realize how much that means to me." His words caught me off guard, and I looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm just being honest," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And that's why it matters," he replied. I felt his hand on mine then, warm and steady. The touch was gentle, but it sent a ripple through me that made my breath hitch. "Luke," I began, but I didn't know what I was going to say. He shifted closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I know what you're thinking because I've been thinking it too." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. My heart pounded in my chest, every logical thought in my mind screaming at me to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But I couldn't move. When he leaned in, his lips brushing mine, it was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. I didn't. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, leaving just the sound of our breaths and the pounding of my heart. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, every doubt and hesitation dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my thoughts a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "I didn't mean to." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "Don't apologize." His eyes searched mine, and I saw the vulnerability in them, the quiet plea for reassurance. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was lying to him or to myself. We sat there for a while, the rain tapping softly against the windows as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I felt his hand still resting on mine, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles against my skin. It was a small gesture, but it grounded me, keeping me from spiraling into the guilt and confusion I could feel bubbling just beneath the surface. "This changes things," I said finally, breaking the silence. I know, he replied. I looked at him, searching his face for some sign of regret, but all I saw was quiet determination. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That's up to you, he said. But I'm not walking away from this, from you. His words sent a wave of warmth through me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. When he left that night, I stood at the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the driveway. The house felt different, heavier and quieter all at once. But I didn't feel as alone as I usually did. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there were boundaries we had crossed and consequences we would have to face. But as I climbed into bed that night, his touch still lingering on my skin, I couldn't bring myself to regret what had happened. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The next time I saw Luke, it was a Saturday evening. The air was thick with the last heat of summer, and the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the front yard. I had spent the day trying to focus on mundane tasks: laundry, sorting through old photo albums, even attempting to organize the cluttered pantry, but nothing seemed to quiet my thoughts. When his truck pulled into the driveway, my pulse quickened. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and moved to the front door just as he stepped onto the porch. "Hey," he said, his smile easy, but there was something in his eyes, a tension, a question, that hadn't been there before. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He carried a bag in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. "I figured we could cook dinner together. I brought everything we need." It was such a simple gesture, but the familiarity of it made my chest ache. He was offering me something I hadn't realized I missed so deeply: companionship, the comfort of shared moments that felt like home. We moved to the kitchen, settling into a rhythm as we prepared the meal. He chopped vegetables while I seared chicken in a skillet, the sounds of the stove and the knife against the cutting board filling the quiet between us. Every now and then our hands would brush as we reached for the same utensil, or his shoulder would bump mine as we moved around the small space. Each touch was a reminder of the night we'd shared, and the unspoken tension between us grew heavier with every passing moment. When dinner was finally ready, we sat down at the table, the glow of the overhead light casting a warm hue over the room. The conversation started light: work, the weather, a funny story about one of his coworkers, but it didn't take long for the mood to shift. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, setting his fork down and leaning back in his chair. I looked up, my stomach tightening. "About what?" "About us." His gaze met mine, steady and unflinching. "About what happened the other night." I set my glass of wine down, my hands trembling slightly. "Luke, I don't..." He held up a hand, stopping me. "Let me finish." I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know this isn't normal," he began, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I know it's complicated, and I know you're probably still trying to make sense of it all. But I also know how I feel, and I need you to know that I don't regret it." His words hit me like a wave, and I struggled to catch my breath. "Luke, this is..." I paused, searching for the right words. "It's not that simple. There's so much to consider, so much that could go wrong." "I know," he said softly, "but it doesn't change how I feel." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I couldn't move. "I've cared about you for a long time," he continued, his voice steady but filled with vulnerability. "And it's not just because of everything you've done for me, or because you've been there when I needed someone. It's more than that." My chest tightened, his words stirring something deep inside me. "Luke," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know if I can do this." He leaned forward, his gaze holding mine. "You don't have to decide anything right now, but I need you to know that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere." After dinner, we moved to the living room, the wine glasses still in our hands. The air between us felt charged, every glance, every movement laden with unspoken meaning. We sat on the couch, closer than we probably should have been, and talked about everything except the one thing that was on both our minds. But eventually, the silence grew too heavy to ignore. "I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff," I said finally, my voice trembling. "And?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "And I don't know what's waiting for me on the other side," I admitted, my eyes dropping to my lap. He reached out, tilting my chin up so I had no choice but to meet his gaze. "Maybe it's not about knowing," he said. "Maybe it's about taking the leap." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. I gave in, my hands tangling in his hair as he pulled me closer, the world around us fading into nothingness. What followed was a blur of warmth and connection, of whispered words and quiet laughter. Every touch, every kiss felt like a revelation, breaking down the walls I'd built around myself for so long. His hands were steady as they traced the curves of my body, his touch reverent, as if he were afraid I might disappear. I could feel the depth of his emotions in every gesture, in the way he held me like I was something precious. For the first time in years, I let myself be vulnerable, let myself feel without questioning or holding back. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting on his chest. "I think so," I said, my voice barely audible. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, his hold on me tightening. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." I didn't respond, my mind too full of emotions I couldn't yet untangle. When he left that night, the house felt both emptier and fuller all at once. I sat in the living room long after he was gone, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin.